Hi everyone. Today we're talking about something that can truly make or break your team's performance, which is workload management. Whether it's hybrid or remote working, the pressure to balance the tasks while maintaining quality and productivity can be overwhelming. So in this two-part series, we'll cover in part one, where I'll break down the meaning of workload and the factors that contribute to it. And in part two, I'll give you practical tools for measuring and supporting your team's workload. So stick around until the end of both parts to get the full picture and actionable tips. So we've all been there before, frustrations and missed deadlines and an overwhelmed team. But as a manager, you have a duty to ensure that your team members are working at a sustainable pace. But how do you do that if you're not sure what is on their plates? So let's jump into part one, where I'll break down what workload really means and what factors contribute to it. So what is workload? Check out these two definitions of workload, and I'll summarize this to say that workload is the total demand placed on the individual or a team over a period of time. So people tend to describe workload to mean work overload, but they are two different things. It is actually about having a balance of having enough work. And so it might be better to describe this as workload management. You want to challenge your team, yes, but without pushing them to the point of stress or burnout. The Yerkes-Dodson law explains that there's a sweet spot when it comes to workload. Too little leads to boredom and too much can result in burnout. So our role as leaders is to help our teams to find that optimal balance, and finding that balance though can be tricky. But what factors contribute to workload? So factor one is time and task constraints. So let's think about time. You've got 24 hours in a day and maybe about 7 to 8 hours for work. So we're all working with a limitation of time. So also imagine that you're juggling balls. You may be able to handle 2 to 3 balls comfortably, but if you add in a third, the risk of dropping one ball increases. So the same principle applies to work. This is where task or work overload happens. So one might comfortably manage 3 projects, meetings or deadlines at once, but adding in a fourth can lead to mistakes and burnout. So as a manager, you need to ensure that your team is juggling the right number of balls to stay engaged and optimal with manageable workload. For remote workers, the challenge of workload management is made greater with isolation and the blurred lines between professional and personal life. And the distractions at home include things like obviously the family, chores, or even poor internet connection. So all of this can add to the unseen pressure. So in terms of work, our job descriptions outlines our responsibility, but in reality, the work on your plate may differ from what is on paper. As a manager, you should have a better understanding of your team's capacity, and it's important to forward plan and map out tasks. I love the concept of workload mapping for this. And this, you start by listing the team's major projects, and then you break it down into manageable chunks. And then if you see that you're asking too much from your team, then you have to just reassess. But more on this in part two. I also like Ali Abdaal's reference to the 5+2 rule. And this is the idea that you can effectively manage between 3 to 7 tasks depending on your experience and capacity at any given period. For anything beyond that, and you are at risk of spreading yourself thin and setting your team up for failure. So factor two is skills gap and misalignment. So sometimes workload feels overwhelming simply because team members don't have the right skills. It's like asking someone to juggle with one hand, so they might be able to manage it, but not without stress. So for instance, let's say that you've asked a team member to produce a PowerPoint presentation. An experienced presenter can do this in a few hours. But for someone who is less skilled, it could take days. So whilst both may be working on the same task, the experience of their workloads are completely different. So addressing the skill gap is not just about training, but it also means giving your team the tools to succeed, whether it's through new software, access to mentors, or even reassessing the tasks that don't align to their strengths. It may also mean reviewing the recruitment and assessment process to get the people with the right level of skills matched to these roles. And this avoids the unnecessary strain on both parties, that is, both the team member and the manager. The issue of communication is another factor to workload management. So imagine yourself as a team member. You may have misunderstood the demand or the work request. And so, for example, you may have been giving a set of instructions to draft a work process, and so that it's checked in by the next day. But you may have misunderstood it to mean that you need to have this work process ready for publishing the next day. So the misunderstanding can increase their perceived workload, and if they spend the next hours on this in addition to the other work that they have to do, this will lead to work overload. And sometimes the setup of remote working is such that you feel that you do not have access to your team where you can actually just drop by and then check in on the work that you have to do or cross-check what you need to be doing. However, linked to the issue of communication is accountability. So both the manager and team member need to be clear about the work that's required. So for the manager, you need to be clear on what is expected from your team member and note this and clarify this in the meetings, whilst also allowing for access so that they can check in with you and follow up on any issues, whether it's through Teams or Slack or any other contact platform. It goes back to my previous video that I shared on one-to-ones, where managers need to set expectations and also create that psychological safety environment where the team member feels that they're able to share when they're feeling overwhelmed or when they need support. However, the team member is also responsible for asking the questions and seeking clarity when needed and being open about the challenges that they are facing and asking for help when needed. This is why the idea of having a paper trail, whether it's through email or through chat, helps with the communication and makes things clearer. So the factor of communication and accountability on both parties can also contribute to work overload. Finally, let's talk about workload creep. Sometimes tasks seem to multiply without us realizing it. A small favor here, an agreed project there, and suddenly your team's workload has expanded. Sometimes it is you, the manager's fault, because you're saying too many yeses to the management team. And there is a situation where the team member is also not able to say no. But we're also talking about a real issue here of increased demand on the team where there are not enough resources. So going back to the example of juggling balls. So if you've got 10 balls spread across 4 team members, but throw in an extra 5 balls and it is not sustainable. So we have all experienced that feeling when you can't even start on a project or have focus time with back-to-back meetings or non-stop email chains. And it's crucial for managers to recognize when this is happening and push back. So for factor 4 around the workload creep, it's also closely linked to setting boundaries. So this is the end of part 1. And I'll say that when it comes to understanding workload, it really comes down to a realistic evaluation of you and your team members' capacity and capabilities. So now that we've covered what workload really means and the factors that contribute to it, you're probably wondering, how do you actually measure this? What tools can you use to stay on top of your team's workload? And more importantly, how can you support them effectively? Well, that's what part 2 is all about. And I'll walk you through practical strategies to help you measure and support your team's workload, whether remotely or in the office. So be sure to hit the notification button and subscribe so you don't miss it. See you in part 2.